Great. Well, my name is John Anderson, and I'm the Minnesota Program Associate here with Solar United Neighbors. And we're gonna, I think, just get started. But I want to say thanks again for everyone taking an interest. I'm gonna share my screen here, and we can get started. Great. So again, thanks again for coming to our Solar 101 about the Lakes and Prairies Solar Co-op. So just a little housekeeping to begin with. Just make sure to choose your mic and speakers for computer audio. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the chat, and we'll try and get you an answer, but we'll also have time for questions at the end. And you can send questions to everyone or just the panelists, depending on what you want. And then also, just as a reminder, we're recording this webinar, and we will be sharing it with everyone after we're done. So I just want to start say thanks so much to our partners. We really can't do this sort of work without their help. And our three main ones would be the West Central Initiative, the Morris Model, and CERTS, the Clean Energy Resource Teams. And we actually have someone from one of those partner groups here today. So I'll hand it over to Cedar Walters.
Great. Thanks, John. I just wanted to take a minute for those of you on today who may not know what West Central Initiative is. So briefly, we are just a place-based foundation and regional planning organization that serves the 9 counties in West Central Minnesota. And we're doing a variety of projects and initiatives based out of our climate action plan that was adopted in late 2023. And that's just a roadmap for the region to become more sustainable, have more resilient communities, invest in clean energy and other solutions that build a resilient and sustainable future. And part of that is supporting solar development. And that's why we are just so excited to be partnering and supporting this solar co-op with Solar United Neighbors. This fits exactly into what we're trying to do, which is make some of these opportunities more accessible for rural communities and rural residents. I'm just going to pop a link in the chat kind of about that climate action plan and some of the other work we're doing, such as recurring monthly meetings around sustainability topics. Actually, tomorrow at noon, we're going to be talking about EVs. So thanks again to Sun for being a great partner. And I know you're all going to learn a lot, so I'll let them take it away. Thank you.
Great. What is Solar United Neighbors? Well, we're a vendor neutral, a national 501c3 nonprofit. So we're not affiliated with any company or product. And we rely entirely on community engagement and involvement to have an impact. And then we're also a national nonprofit, and we have field staff in 12 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico as well. What do we do? Well, to put it simply, we're here to help people go solar, join together, and fight for their energy rights. To sort of just a brief overview of our national impact. So far, we've helped over 9,500 families go solar. That adds up to about 79 plus megawatts of solar overall, and quite a bit of metric tons of CO2 saved as well. Sorry. And here's the impact that we've had so far in the state of Minnesota. Again, around 270 families have gone solar. That adds up to 2.3 megawatts of installed capacity. And then you can also see that's having a real economic impact across the state as well. So how did Sun get started? Well, the story begins back in 2007 when our executive director, Anya, who's there in the middle in the black shirt, she went and saw with her son, Walter, went and saw the movie An Inconvenient Truth, if you remember that one. And Walter got really excited by that. He's there with his friend Diego, and they saw it together. And they came home and said, "Mom, we have to go solar." So Anya started looking into it and found that actually, this is back in 2007, going solar was pretty difficult. There was all sorts of rules and regulations in Washington, D.C., where she worked. She kept getting different answers from different groups. And so what they decided to do was to go sort of door to door in her neighborhood of Mount Pleasant and get see if other people were interested in as well. And they found that there was a lot of interest in the neighborhood. And they got around 50 families together or so who all wanted to go in together. And it was a lot of work, but they finally figured out how to do it. And once they were able to sort of do this neighborhood project, they started hearing from folks from other parts of Washington, D.C., but also, areas of Virginia and Maryland who are like, "Oh, this is so cool. Like, help me do it in my area too." So that's sort of how it got helped how it got started. It took about 2 years actually for the first project to work, but in the end, eventually 45 homes went solar, and after that, that's sort of how the co-op model was born. So looking forward to today, we have about members in all 50 states. We have programs, and actually this is out of date, but it's 12 now, and Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. We've run or over 400 solar co-ops as well. Um, so just to talk a little bit about our theory of change, like I said earlier, our idea is sort of a sort of self enforcing cycle of helping people go solar, join together, and then fight for their energy rights. And the whole idea is that building a new, fair energy system for the 21st century, where the benefits are broadly shared, rather than simply building out our sort of pre-existing 20th century system. So I'm just going to talk briefly about working for equity. Um, one of the realities of how our energy system works in America is that certain communities in the U.S. have a disproportionate share of the costs of our energy production, but also receive fewer benefits. So examples that could include, coal country in Appalachia, so-called Cancer Alley in Louisiana, or urban communities with high levels of air pollution. And despite these costs, if you actually look at the access to electricity and energy in these communities, they tend to bear both disproportionately these negative costs, as well as having to pay higher prices for electricity and face less reliability as well. And families of color are disproportionately harmed by these sort of higher utility bills and shutoffs. And on top of that, housing discrimination is a very real reality, and that can be another barrier to solar as well. So, rooftop solar lets communities invest locally, create good local jobs, and bring control of the energy system within our reach. And we're really working towards a new energy system that everyone can participate in, and one that's fair and equitable. So what we're going to cover today, I'm going to talk a little bit about solar technology and then solar economics, and then we're going to have a good example sort of locally about how someone was able to go solar. And then I'll just briefly talk about how the Lakes and Prairies Solar Co-op works. And then finally, we'll have some time at the end for questions as well. So just to talk a little bit about solar technology. Um, uh, how do solar panels work? Solar photovoltaic or PV panels essentially convert solar energy into electricity. And the way that works is, light from the sun strikes the solar cells in those solar panels, and that creates a stream of electrons, which is what all electricity is, a stream of electrons, but in the form of DC or direct current, which is the same type of electricity that you get, say, from a car battery. An inverter then turns that DC into AC or alternating current. And that's the type of electricity that you use in your home or your business that powers your refrigerator, et cetera, et cetera. And then any excess electricity generated can go back onto the grid. The majority of today's solar market is this sort of photovoltaic technology. There are other forms like solar thermal technology to heat water or a pool. That does exist. We don't really work on that, but there are other forms of this technology as well. That's sort of a little different. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about important terminology. So if you look at our little diagram here, when I talk about a solar array, that refers to the panels that would be on your house. And that's what generates that DC or direct current electricity from the energy from the sun. And then a solar inverter, it changes that DC electricity into AC electricity that then you can use in your house to do things like power your refrigerator, etc. There's an electrical panel in your home that then sends that AC electricity either into your house to power your home, and any excess can go back on your grid, back onto the grid where your neighbors can use it, and in exchange you get a credit from your utility. And then number four there is the utility meter. This tracks how much electricity is flowing into your home from the power grid, say on a cold winter night like last night, where you wouldn't be generating any electricity and you'd be using some. But it could also say track the other way. If you it was say a very sunny day in May, you don't have the air conditioning on, and you'd be generating a lot of electricity and putting it back onto the grid for your essentially people in your neighborhood or surrounding area to use. This is sort of, I'm going to talk just briefly here about system components. Um, this is what a sort of a solar panel is made of. As you can see, it's like a sandwich with a bunch of different layers on it. The solar cells, sort of in the middle, that's what turns the sun's energy into actual electricity. The frame and the glass is then what sort of goes around that to protect those solar cells. The junction box is what transmits the power from the cells to your actual inverter, which again changes the electricity from DC to AC. And those are sort of the different, the different sort of layers that go into that. And a solar panel, there's sort of three sort of layers here. An individual solar cell is quite small, and there's a bunch of them in a solar panel between say 60 and 72. And then in a solar array, there's going to be a number of different panels depending on the size of your roof, what your energy needs are, and not so much. A typical solar panel is pretty big. It's about 6 feet by 3.5 feet, or the size of a normal sized American flag. And again, each panel again has a bunch of different cells, and then that makes up one panel, and then a bunch of different panels makes up an array, um, if that makes sense. Just gonna talk now about some important terminology, which you might remember from maybe your high school physics class. But a watt is a unit of power that's used to measure the rate at which electricity is consumed. So you could think of like a 60-watt light bulb. When you turn that on, it's using 60 watts of energy. And a kilowatt is a unit of power that's equal to 1,000 watts. And then a kilowatt hour is a unit of energy that is equal to using a kilowatt over the course of an hour of time. And that's generally, if you were to look at your electrical meter, that's what the numbers on there would be tracking. So let's say you wanted to make your backyard really bright, and you took 160-watt bulbs and you hooked them all together. That would and turned it on. That would use 6 kilowatts of power. And then if you left it on for an hour, that would be 6 kilowatt hours. For 2 hours, 12, etc. So here's just some scale example of how big an array might be. The average size is about 6 kilowatts to 7 kilowatts, but of course that can vary. And if you look at sort of the average size of a person, that's about how big a 4.8 kilowatt solar panel array would be. Which and 4.8's, it's a little on the smaller side, but that just gives you a sense of how large these are. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the system components that are racking. That's the system that's going to attach the solar panels themselves to your roof. This is a pretty standard form of racking on a pretty normal shingled roof that's elevated at a pitch. But there are a number of different kinds. Um, uh, for example, if you had a flat roof, you could use, instead of that sort of being bolted into the side of the roof, you could use a ballast system that uses the weight of ballast to keep the solar panels on there. You can also, if you have a metal roof, you can use things like clamps and that sort of thing. So depending on the type of roof you have, there's pretty much always there's usually a solution, and that's something that you would be working with the installer to figure out. Um, Most systems in Minnesota are going to be on those sort of pitch roofs with shingles. They're going to use flashing and that sort of thing to make sure that no water can get in. Um, and then again, you can also, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but there's also ways of doing this to just mount the solar panels directly on the ground. Um, and then, yeah, the big thing to remember is that there is a racking solution for the vast majority of roof types, whether that's asphalt shingle or clay or metal tiles or a metal roof or a rubber membrane roof. Um, if anyone, I don't think anyone here probably has a slate roof. The, those aren't very common in this part of the country. But if you did have a slate roof, they can still put a solar array on, but it's just going to cost a little bit more because it's a little more complicated. Here's an example again of a racking that would be going on a standing seam metal roof. This one would, would be using clamps and things like that, a little different than the one with the shingles. And here's an example of a ground mounted system. The good thing about ground mounted is you can have a larger array as um, it's not restricted by the size of your roof. And also you can angle it directly at the sun for sort of the maximum generation. But it does cost a little bit more because you have to have that metal structure to support it. And then it's best, if you have a really big yard or you live, maybe on a farm or something like that, because you need obviously a lot of space to put one of these things. I'm going to talk just briefly here about inverters. Again, that's what converts that AC power from the solar panels to, or excuse me, the direct current DC power from the panels to AC that you can use in your home. There's a number of different types, and the big thing to remember is that the installer will be able to work with you for the best type that fits your situation. So here's an example of one type. It's called a central string inverter. And it basically just connects a number of panels together in a string. This is best when you have when all the panels, there's very little shade, and so all the panels will be generating the same amount of electricity at the same time. Um, and then if that's not the case, say you have a roof that has some shade at some part of the day and some shade not going on, and the panels might be generating a different amount. You could use microinverters, which sort of treats each panel separately, or what's called the central inverter with DC optimizers. That's that one on the bottom. Um, and that's just another way to address if your panels are generating different amounts of electricity at different times. Again, the big thing is your installer will know what is the best inverter for you and figure out a system that works best for your situation. And then another important component here is the electrical panel. Um, and if you have a new modern electrical panel and it's not all filled up, it's not a big deal. But if you do have one of those old-fashioned fuse boxes like my parents used to have, that will need to be replaced because you need a sort of modern panel with enough spots in it in order to hook it up. So there is a cost associated with putting in a new panel, but that can go to the federal tax credit. Um, to keep that in mind. And so here's a good question is what's a good roof for solar? The ideal direction for a solar roof would be to face true south and with no shade. That's the sort of ideal type. If your roof is facing sort of east or west directly, those are still workable. They're going to generate a little bit less electricity, about sort of 80% compared to directly south, but it still can work. And then a roof that faces largely just north is usually just not economically viable. It just doesn't make sense to put an array on there because it's not going to generate enough power. Um, and again, ideally, the roof would have little to no shading. Um, another thing to keep in mind is having enough space to mount all the panels. Like we were looking at those graphics earlier, these panels are actually fairly big. I mean, you're talking about a number of them that can kind of add up. And a large roof can also lose space to things like dormers, vents, chimneys, and you can't use all of the space because the state fire code requires a chunk of the roof to be open in case the firefighters need to cut in. Um, the long and the short of it is, depending on the size of your roof and what's on it, you might have constraints about how big your system can get. But that's something that your installer will be able to work with you to figure out. Just to give a sort of rough ballpark type of example, you typically need about 200 square feet of unobstructed roof space to mount a system of about 2 kilowatts, and that's a very small system. So if you wanted a 6 kilowatt array, you need about 600 square feet, 20 feet by 30 feet, if that makes sense. And then this is important too, is the age of the roof and its condition. If the roof has less than 10 years of life left, we'd really recommend that you replace the roof before you go solar. At a minimum, the roof should take as long as it takes to sort of for the system to pay for itself. And in Minnesota, that's going to be roughly between 10 and 15 years. It's still possible to redo your roof when you have solar panels already on it, but it's more time consuming, it's gonna cost more, and it can be a bit of a headache. So again, if you have an older roof or a roof maybe had some hail damage or something like that, that's something that you should take care of before you actually go solar. So now I'm just going to talk about what net metering is. This is, again, this is the diagram like we had before. The solar panels are generating electricity. That electricity is being converted to AC power. And then some of that's going to be used in your home to run your refrigerator or your lights. But let's say you have extra power. You can put that back on the grid to be used by a neighbor or someone in your community. In exchange, the electrical utility will then give you a credit for putting that back on. And so here's a very simple example of what an electric bill might look like. Um, if you use 300 kilowatt hours while exporting 200 kilowatt hours that you generated, you'd only have to pay for 100 kilowatt hours on your bill. And then this might be what your bill might look like, say, in when it's not particularly sunny out. But then, say, if the month was really, really summer or really, really sunny, you might actually have exported more than you used, and that credit would go the other way. Now I'm just going to talk briefly about batteries, um, about and how you can use them when the power goes out. If the power goes out, you don't actually want to just keep putting electricity from your solar panels back onto the grid because that could electrocute one of the line workers who's trying to get the power back on. So the way that these systems are built is they are set up to automatically shut off during a power outage. And then they turn back on automatically when the power comes back on. So if you want to be able to have your own power during a blackout or something like that, you would need a battery system to go along with your solar panel for that to work. Um, why might you want a battery system? Maybe you're in an area with frequent utility outages. Maybe you have critical loads at home. That could be a well pump, that could be medical equipment, or maybe you just want to be very prepared for some sort of emergency or something like that. Um, it's And one thing to keep in mind is right now in Minnesota, all that you can use your battery power to do really is to just power your own system during an outage. You can't actually put that power back on the grid, say at night, and get a credit for that. The law doesn't allow for that. So you can use those batteries during an outage, but you can't sort of use them for that net metering crediting. So here's an example of a battery system. Um, the Johnsons here over on the right, they lose power several times a year, so they decided it just made sense for them to put in a system to deal with that. They have a 13.5 kilowatt battery bank, which can be fully recharged by the solar array during the day. But if there's no sun shining and the power's out, they have only about 1 day of power. What you can run on it is not everything. So maybe a refrigerator, microwave, some lights, maybe a modem, a small air conditioner. You can't really run an electric stove or a water heater or a big piece of equipment because that would just drain the batteries very, very quickly. So if you have a battery system, you can't do everything you can do, but you can do things like run things that are really sort of important to you. Here's just an example of the cost. Um, and battery life systems depends on the technology that's used, but it's usually between 5 and 10 years. And these are just rough examples. And the actual cost will differ by location, by technology, and by the amount, the sort of desired size of the load that you want to run. And then we have a great battery storage guide on our website. If you just go there at solarunitedneighbors.org/storage. Um, there's that link right there. So now I'm just going to go over some frequently asked questions. What are the warranties that come with a solar panel? Well, there's two types of warranties. The first one is called a production warranty. Uh, Solar panels, one of the really cool things about them is because they have no moving parts. They haven't they last for a really long time. Over time, they will get less and less efficient, but still, after over 25 years, they might go from 100% efficient from day one to around 80 to say 87% efficient, which is still, if you think about over 25 years, is pretty impressive. But that production warranty will cover the ability of the panel to keep generating. So if you had a panel that went from 100% and 5 years in, it's now at 60%, the warranty would cover the cost of having a new panel for that. And then there's another panel called the product warranty, and that covers any sort of defects or problems that happen in the manufacturing process. And those usually last from 12 to 25 years. Um, uh, when it comes to homeowners insurance, you have to have it in order to have a solar system. In terms of maintenance, very little. They're designed to sort of let the rain naturally sort of wash them, and they're also designed. They're put at an angle, so they're sort of designed for the snow to naturally melt and then slide off. Maybe if they've got really dusty out or something like that, you might want to wash them off with just water and some sort of something like a towel or something like that. And there are companies too that will also clean them, but usually that's not something you have to do regularly. And most systems, they have a lifespan of 25 years, which is pretty long. Um, as for if you live in a homeowners association, will they allow solar on your home? Yes, they have to. We actually were instrumental in help passing a law recently that in Minnesota that now requires HOAs to allow solar as long as you meet some basic requirements. However, if you live in a historic district, that can be a little tougher. I'm just going to talk briefly about solar economics. Um, Solar really is a great investment. As you can see, the technology of photovoltaic cells has been around for a while, but the cost of them has really gone down. Not just from the 1970s when people first started talking about them, but the cost has dropped 73% since 2010, and it's no longer really a specialty or boutique project. It has an excellent return on investment, and there's that 30% federal tax credit as well. Um, Here's an example of hypothetical pricings for a sort of sample array. If you're in the ALP utilities area, so I think that's around Alexandria, if I'm correct. So this is looking at pricing of about 320 a watt. And as you can see, I won't go through all the numbers here, but you can see an 8 kilowatt array and 15 kilowatt array, the 15 kilowatt would cost a little bit more. But again, the tax credit would go up for that. And based on these ideas, based on these sort of calculations, you'd be paying for these arrays over the lifespan. You'd have a net positive income from all the from net metering and putting your electricity back on the grid. And again, this is just a sort of sample, hypothetical example. So now I'm just going to talk about just a little bit about loans. Like I said, there's a great return on investment, but if you need a loan, you can usually go through the installer. They often will have organizations that they work with on that, or you can do it on your own. You can use a home equity line of credit. Refinancing can include solar. And we have a great website or a great page on our website, which goes over financing and that sort of thing. And yeah, we always advise you to compare several different loan products, shop around, that sort of thing. Um, I'm just going to talk briefly about some financing opportunities that are out there as well. One organization that's here in Minnesota is the Center for Energy and the Environment, or CEE. They have a whole lending center. If you just Google lending center at CEE or CEE, they have a lot of great resources on there. You can also get green solar loans through credit unions, such as Affinity Plus or Highway. Um, and there's some other credit unions and member cooperatives out there that sometimes will give financing as well. So here's just an example of what that CEE, the Center for Energy and the Environment, they do residential solar loans through the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, and there's some of the terms that they have. But again, they have a lot of great resources online, and they're great to work with. If you just contact them, they can often help you out a lot. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about solar incentives, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other programs. So one of the big incentives out there right now is the federal tax credit. So it's 30% of the cost of the whole system. It's not refundable, so you can't get a check back, but you can roll it over year after year if you don't have a tax burden high enough to cover that 30% in the first year. And then this is the current law. It's scheduled to be around until 2032, and then it'll be sunlit after that as well. But I'm going to hand it over to Bobby, who's going to talk a little bit about incentives for farmers and rural small businesses.
Thanks, John. Um, yeah, solar makes a lot of sense for homeowners, but for farmers and rural small businesses, there's some loan programs, some grant programs, and some additional incentives that can really make it the smart thing to do financially. I'm going to talk a little bit about these three incentives, and then Carmen Fernholz is here, who a farmer in Madison, Minnesota, who use these programs to go solar. He can talk a little bit about his experience. So I'm going to go through accelerated depreciation, something called PACE financing, and then REAP grants. Do the next slide there, John, please. So solar panels are eligible for accelerated depreciation. So you can depreciate the full value of the solar over 5 years. So if your farm or rural small business has a tax appetite large enough to fully utilize the 30% tax credit, which also applies to businesses, and this accelerated depreciation, that can really significantly lower your payback period. That is, when what you've paid for the solar is equal to the value of the electricity you produced over the years, and after that, you're really making money. Next slide. So farms and rural businesses are eligible for Minnesota PACE loans, and that's run through the St. Paul Port Authority. It's a statewide loan. They're very easy to work with. It's a relatively low fee, low interest, and it's paid via your property taxes. So there's some good financing available for rural small businesses and farmers. Go to the next slide there. So the next incentive for rural small businesses and farmers is a REAP grant, so Rural Energy for America program. So these grants can cover up to 50% of project costs. There's a picture there of a 35 kilowatt system in Litchfield, Minnesota, that farmers used our REAP guide to get a REAP grant from. With the REAP grant and the other incentives, their expected payback period is 7 years. It's a competitive grant process. We'd recommend either working with an installer that's familiar with REAP or a grant writer. But some folks have just hunkered down, used our guide, and done it on their own too. Go to the next slide there, John. So, to be eligible applicant for REAP, you need to be an ag producer. So you have to have 51% or more of your gross income from production. It's just how they define it. And or a business in a rural community that has a net worth of less than 15 million and annual income under 5 million. What's the next slide there? So what's eligible for a REAP grant is the portion of the solar array that benefits the farm or rural business. So for businesses, this is easy. With farms, it can get complicated because the REAP grant won't pay for it won't pay for electricity used in your home. But there's grant writers and installers that are used to figuring that out, and there's a worksheet you do to figure out how much of your electricity is from your home versus your farm. And 51% of the production must go towards the business end to qualify for a REAP grant. And so in other words, the grant won't cover solar that's going for a residence. But you can put up an array that also powers your home, and you'll just deduct what portion of that of your array goes to your home from what you put in for the grant, if that kind of makes sense. Next slide there. So here's just some sample numbers to start looking at how it might look like. So if you put up a 20 kilowatt system, we got $3 a watt in there, 60,000 bucks. The tax credit is 18,000. Let's say you get a REAP grant for 40%. It was 40% at one time. Now it can go up to 50%. Let's say you got that REAP grant at 24,000. Your final cost there, your net cost is 18,000. And then, as soon as you turn on those solar panels, they're generating electricity, which has value. So the annual energy production of that is valued at $3,380. So the payback period here is 5.3 years, which is just tremendous. And that's not even including accelerated depreciation. So I just think rural small businesses and farmers, it's going to be worth your time if you have any kind of decent place to put up solar to get a proposal from an installer, look at the numbers and take it to your banker. And a lot of farmers that are skeptical that we've worked with, once they get into their banker looks at the numbers and says, well, why wouldn't you do this? This is a moneymaker for you. Next slide there. Yeah. So we have a great guide. This guide is for how you apply for a REAP grant. And we designed it so folks could apply for a REAP grant on their own if they want to. It's very complicated. It's very time consuming, but you can do it. But the REAP guide's also just going to be helpful if you're working with a grant writer or an installer to get a REAP grant. It'll let you understand all the parameters are and how to think about it. And it's a step-by-step process. So if you're a rural small business or a farmer and you want to join the co-op, and we'd encourage you to, when you go to join, there's a more information box at the bottom. Just put in there that you're a farmer or a rural small business and you're interested in a REAP grant and the incentives for farmers and small businesses, and we can help make sure that you get plugged into these incentives, and we'll try to make it work for you. But we've also got Carmen Fernholz here, who's just going to speak to his direct experience going solar on his farm and using all three of these incentives. Carmen, you want to jump in?
I can certainly jump in, and I'm just going to do a flyover on some of the experiences that I've had. First of all, the picture up there is the solar array that we installed and turned on May 10th of 2024. I guess one of the first things that I would like to emphasize is really find yourself a good installer. And by a good installer, I mean someone who not only is going to do a good job of installing, but who's going to know the industry, is going to know the products that are the best to utilize in your system. And I think, especially in the rural areas, an installer who has a good working relationship with many of the rural electric co-ops that are out there in the greater part of Minnesota, because you want to have a good working relationship with the co-op uh, and make things run smoothly as you can. So I think the installer is a critical person. I'm going to jump around here though. My my setup here is the maximum capacity that I could build with my co-op, and I think it's what 37.2 kilowatt capacity, and it seems to serve quite well. We had a unique situation though on the farm, is because I retired and have rented the land to a neighbor, but I still have an enterprise with the renter in the livestock, and so we were able to qualify for a REAP grant. Uh, just a sidebar on the REAP grant: if you're going to go for the REAP grant, know that unless you're really adept at understanding grants, that it's a challenge. And so if you've got someone to assist you in applying for that REAP grant, by all means, take that assistance. I wouldn't have been able to do it myself. In fact, I wasn't sure that I'd even gotten the grant, because when they did evaluate it, they said I had a very low number, and what they call a low number was in the 30s. Don't ask me what that means, but it was in the 30s, and so I was pretty skeptical. But about a month ago, I received an email from the Minnesota agency, and they said I was awarded the grant. It wasn't the 40% or the 50%. It amounted to about 30, about 35%, but a significant amount when I look at the total cost of the installation that I had. So it's worth your time, if you get some assistance, to definitely apply for that PACE and get that help to make REAP grant, and make sure you get the help then, so that you fill out all the right boxes and whatever it takes. Um, Jumping around, one thing I noticed about our solar is that we used no cement in installation. Our installer had a pile driver and drove posts in the ground. So just in case, looking into the future, things change and it has to be removed or taken away or whatever, you don't have all of the cement to contend with. Pull the poles, remove the panels, everything, and you can move it. It seems like a small thing, but in reality, it could be a major thing. Um, Another piece that's unique to me is I'm close to retirement, so my tax benefits, in fact, I am supposed to be retired, sort of. My tax benefits are limited. However, I am in the process of selling a lot of my equipment, and so have the potential of generating some significant income in the next few years. And so definitely the tax benefit, the tax credits are going to be a benefit. Definitely be in touch with your tax person, because they can certainly help you through this. My tax person says, looking at your situation, within a couple of years, your tax benefits are definitely going to be there for the installation. Um, Jumping to the PACE grant, or the PACE loan, I called the St. Paul Port Authority and just got in touch with them. And personal experience that I've had with them is they are really, really good people to work with. They help you through all of the loops and hoops and everything, and really set things up for you. And then they work with the local county so that the whole loan then is put on your real estate taxes, and you end up making a payment twice a year right along with your other tax payments. And I can personally tell you the rate that they gave me was I believe it was 5.5% fixed interest over 10 years. And so looking at my budgeting, that's going to work out just fine. Payback depends on what you figure in as a benefit. Obviously, the tax benefits are there, but I can tell you, we turned on the solar on the 10th of May, and today, even going through the month of January, we still have over $400 in credits to the local REC. And as you'll note, the days are getting longer, so we're going to get a little more sunshine and warming up. So we're going to have a little less electrical usage because our farm happens to be all electric. Everything on that farm, there's no propane, nothing else but electric, including the house. And so I really feel that with that kind of credit already, uh, we can really see the benefits of the solar installation. I'm looking at this. Anything else? Oh, the one final thing. Do you have a picture of that screenshot? There it is. I really love this Enphase app because any day I can go on there and see how much electricity that solar array is producing. And this is only one shot, and this probably can't see it very well, but it tells you how much electricity I produced in 2024, and it's already accumulating 2025. It also goes day by day and month by month, so you can track this thing very well. And it's interesting because the more you track it, the more you understand how the light and everything else impacts it, even your usage on the farm. So I guess that's a quick summary of some of the experiences that I've had. I certainly am satisfied with it. Maintenance seems to be at minimum, and I really, again, emphasize find yourself a good installer, and I know you will save a lot of headaches and a lot of issues. That would be all I'd have to say.
Yep. Thanks, Carmen. Carmen actually did not go solar through one of our co-ops. We didn't have one there at the time, but the the installer we select for the co-op will meet all the criteria Carmen's talking about. And then whether you go solar at your farm or rural small business or on your home, every inverter has some type of app function like Carmen is talking about, where you'll be able to see how much solar, how much electricity your panels are producing, which panels are working, if one's not operating. So it's a pretty cool way to track how things are working in real time. Any questions for Carmen before I turn it back over to John or in the chat? People got anything? All right, thank you, everybody.
Great. Well, thanks again to Bobby and Carmen. We really appreciate it. I'm just going to close out here by just talking a little bit about how solar co-ops like the Lakes End Prairie Solar Co-op work. So why join a solar co-op? Well, we'd say that we can get you the best value on installation, that we can provide support throughout the process, and it's a great way to connect with fellow solar enthusiasts in your area, and also a way to become part of the growing solar movement. And when it comes to sort of why solar co-ops can get a better price, the things are, this is just sort of a graph that looks at the costs associated with solar installation over the last 15 years or so. And the big thing to notice is that the system components have gotten a lot cheaper as the technology to manufacture solar panels gets better and better. And the labor costs have come down, as well as people get more efficient at figuring out how to install them. So the biggest cost for most solar installers now is the soft costs, and a huge chunk of that is finding customers. When you think about people who are interested in putting solar on their home, it's a very real group of people, but it's not a really big chunk of the population. So the fact that we're able to go to a solar installer and say, we have 50 people in this area who are really excited about putting solar, they're really interested, and they want to move forward, that is a huge benefit for them because they don't have to spend lots of money on things like direct mail or billboards or radio ads. Maybe you've seen some of those around the state. But those can be really expensive. So the fact that we can go to them with a list of people who already are really interested in going forward means that we can get a pretty good price. And this is sort of the solar co-op process overall. It starts out with sort of us getting the word out and that sort of thing. At this point, we're sort of in the middle of the process. We are, we've already done a number of these events, and we actually put the request for proposal, or RFP, out, I think 2 weeks ago. And that's been out, and I think the due date for interested installers is tomorrow afternoon. So we've already gotten around 50 people to join the co-op, and which is a good starting number. And we're waiting to hear back from the installers who are interested in sort of competing to be the installer. And the next stuff coming up will be sort of choosing that installer, and then the co-op will be open pretty much through the end of March. So so the RFPs are due back from the installers tomorrow. And then the selection committee will be probably meeting on the 6th. If you've checked that you're interested in that, we'll be getting in touch with you with an email to sort of choose that date and time. Again, it's going to be open for anyone who's still interested in joining through the end of March. But we're sort of getting to the last sort of 6 weeks or 2 months, as it were, of the process. So that's sort of where things stand. And what's next? Well, if you're interested in joining the co-op, we'd love to have you. If you just go to our website, which is right up there, or if you just Google Lakes and Prairies Solar Co-op, it should pop right up. You just click the button that says join the co-op, and there'll be some stuff for you to put information in about yourself and your home and that sort of thing. But yeah, we'd love to have you if you're interested. And then the more people can get involved, generally the better a price we can get. So if you know of anyone who's still sort of interested or might be maybe on the fence, I would encourage you to send them the website, or to send them our contact info. I can also give you a PDF of our flyer if you're interested in sort of spreading that in a community group or listserv that you're on as well. So the more people involved, the better. Yeah. And that's sort of all I have. I want to thank everyone so much for taking the time to come. And then thanks also to Bobby, Cedar, and Carmen for speaking as well. But I guess we have about a half an hour left, and I think we're just gonna throw that open for Q&A. I think we'll sort of do an informal process here. But again, thanks everyone, and we'd love to have you sign up for the co-op if you haven't already. And if you're already a member, you have any questions, feedback, you'd like to connect with me, feel free to just email the MN team. That's our sort of group email, or my own personal email. If you want to connect directly with me, is just janderson, SON, @solarunitedneighbors.org. But thanks so much. So I think we'll now just go to questions.